Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Diversity in FinTech series, where we'll be talking about gender diversity in finance with Melanie Richards. Melanie is the former Deputy Chair of KPMG UK and is a strategic, commercial, collaborative and compassionate leader. She has worked in both banking and professional services, advising business leaders and boards for nearly 4 decades, and has been a long-standing champion for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Melanie is tireless in her efforts to improve inclusivity in the workplace. Throughout her career, Melanie has supported, mentored, and coached women and men, helping them to grow their networks and progress their careers. Thanks to her influence, in 2014, KPMG was one of the first to publish detailed diversity workforce targets. She was named the #1 Financial Times Female Champion for Women in Business in 2017, is a member of the Hampton-Alexander Review Steering Committee, and is a founding member of the 30% Club Steering Committee. In 2018, she received an award for her outstanding contribution to social mobility. Melanie sits on the Employers Board of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London and on the advisory board of the National University of Singapore Business School Centre on Artificial Intelligence for Humankind. She also advises public sector leaders to deliver world-leading public services. She is the chair of the Eve Appeal, a charity which raises awareness and funds research into the early detection of gynecological cancers, and a member of the board of the National Theatre. In 2016, she received an honorary doctorate business administration from Oxford Brookes University. And in 2019, Melanie received a CBE for her contribution to business and the diversity and inclusion agenda. So, wow, what a career, Melanie. How did you expect that when you first were starting out your career? Did you envision that you would achieve all these fantastic things?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's very kind of you to introduce me in that way. I have to say, I always slightly quietly squirm inside. And no, of course, you don't know when you start out on your career where it's going to end up. And in fact, that's part of the fun of it. That's the part of the kind of adventure. I've never had a big plan that said, this is what I'm going to do. And some of the things I've done have been a sort of serendipity as to why I've ended up doing them, whether it's people I meet or opportunities that have been put in my way, or maybe I've gone and looked for. So no, there was no grand plan. I'm afraid to disappoint, but it has been fun, and hopefully will continue to be fun. We're talking about me like I've ended, but hopefully I will continue.
For sure. I mean, you talk about opportunities coming up. Do you think there's any way we can poise ourselves to access opportunities and really make the most of them when they do come along?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, and we can talk a bit about why did I end up in any of the roles that I've ended up in. But as I say, serendipity played a part. But one of the things I always say is, people talk about networking, and they always talk about it, in my humble opinion, in a way that talks about it as if it's something you do to go and get something from somebody. And I have a fairly simple philosophy around networking, which is, what can I do to help the other person? And then in time, one sometimes finds that having helped lots of other people, they sort of want to help you. I think that's the first thing. I think, and I don't do it with the intent of how can I get something from somebody. It's only ever, I'm sort of sounding rather kind of virtuous here, but I genuinely do believe that, which I think is, the more we can help each other, the better, and the more we collaborate, the better. The second thing I would say is that don't underestimate the power of networking. Even, where you are today, it isn't something that's an activity that starts in the workplace. Or for me, it's about how you sort of deal with connections and how you stay connected. Now, I'm going to sound rather old, but your generation has a bigger advantage over ours in that you can reach out and reconnect with people on LinkedIn almost anywhere. People are on social media, but at the end of the day, you have to retain personal connections. You can't just pop up and ask people to do things for you. And so I think thinking about your network, even where you are today, I mean, I've got people that I am still connected with that I started my career with, you know, that I've known for 40 years. And those relationships are special, as are the relationships, I'm sure, and bonds that you're building, whether it's inside the society or in your broader kind of cohort of student contacts.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about like trying to give first before you get something from someone. I think approaching things like that way is definitely more rewarding as well. And it sounds like that's benefited you a lot in your career. So perhaps to start off, you could give a short introduction to you and your former role and experiences at KPMG.
So, if you don't mind, I thought maybe I'd give a very quick pen portrait of my entire career, and then you can kind of probe me if that's all right. And
Sure.
Good news, listeners, I'm not going to do a blow by blow of every one of the 40 years. I'm going to kind of do some big picture moments. So, I think first off, one of the interesting things is I started work in 1982, which was at about the same time as we'd been through kind of quite a big economic crisis at that time. And I made a decision to go straight into the world of work, which I was really torn. Did I go to uni? Did I go straight into the world of work? And in the end, I plumbed for that. I'm not actually saying which one is better than the other. And I joined retail banking and very quickly discovered this is a lesson in things that you learn you don't want to do quite quickly. So I spent a very short time there, but fortunately I'd joined a very large organisation, NatWest, and there were opportunities to move into other areas, and I made sure that my voice was heard. And you know, interesting question, how do you do that? And you don't do it by banging people's doors down. You do it hopefully with a bit of charm and humility. I think humility is a long lost sometimes for some people, skill and capability. And I remember going to the kind of very senior guy, and I'd only been there for a couple of years, and said, look, you know, I don't think this is really working for me. But I didn't do it in a way that was disrespectful, because a lot of people in that organisation liked what they did. And I said, you know, I'd like to move to do something different. I gave the rationale for why. He offered me an opportunity to move to London because I was born and raised in Wales, hence the Welsh dragon over my right shoulder, very, very important part of me and who I am. And when I moved to London, I entered the kind of corporate and investment banking part of NatWest, and then moved through the ranks. And I guess I describe the things that I moved in and out of as a function of my demonstration of my commitment to how I worked and my curiosity. So I did a whole variety of very different things, which I was able to do, and ended up doing private placements, essentially raising capital for UK companies mainly, but also international groups, large global groups from US private placement investors. And that took me to Hambros, which was, they approached me and asked me if I'd like to come and lead their team, which I have to say I approached with terror. And it wasn't, you know, I'd been at NatWest at the time for 15 years, so it wasn't the most natural thing for me to just suddenly jump ship. I had a lot of loyalty to people. But the reason I'm telling you all of this is that none of these things or these steps were planned or organised or indeed easy, actually. But the move was a really good one for me. Clients came with me. It gave me kind of the opportunity to grow in a way that maybe I hadn't been able to where I was. And then KPMG came along and asked me to set up an independent debt advisory business, which appealed to me greatly because I like giving advice to clients and I like it to be independent of any sort of product or potential conflict. And so that's what I came to KPMG to do, and spent a large part of my almost 20 years at KPMG in that part of the business, essentially giving advice to clients on how to raise capital. And then most latterly, about 7 years ago, I joined the board, and I've been involved in a kind of broader leadership context. I've chaired our risk committee. I've sat on most of the committees of the board. I've been an ambassador, if you like, for the firm, in the sense that I do a lot of public speaking, and I have responsibility for building relationships with clients. And I think the one thing I would say is that I feel very blessed and privileged, but maybe it is the only conscious thing that I have done, is that I've always focused on what gives me joy, if that makes sense. Now, that's not to suggest that every day of my working life is a joy. We have to have some reality check here, because, you know, some of the things I've had to do in the sense of, you know, the amount of stress, the amount of work, etc. It's not all plain sailing, but you have to decide what excites you. And as you're working through, not every day will be exciting, not every day will be joyful, but a good proportion of them need to be, in my view, for you to be finding yourself in the right place. And I've constantly kind of held myself. Luckily for me, that's come quite naturally, but I think it's a good way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful tool to have a kind of principle that guides you throughout your career. And you mentioned that you've changed your actual company and role quite a few times throughout your whole journey. I guess along with those shifts, a lot of challenges would come about, whether it's like just the risk of moving to a new location, like settling yourself in a new company, in a new environment. How have you managed those changes?
So you're right, and as I alluded to, it isn't always all smooth sailing. And I think, you know, I think the COVID crisis has taught us this, right? I mean, this is on a whole other level for all of us. And, you know, you and I were chatting before we came live on, you know, some of the challenges of today. But what I would say is, you know, you can be defined by not just who you are and what you are, but also how you navigate adversity, if I can put it that way. And I remember the first, it wasn't the only thing that happened, but probably about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years into my career at NatWest, I remember not getting a promotion that I absolutely thought I was bang on to get and I was thoroughly deserving of. And when I look back at that time, it felt, if I look back at it with the benefit of hindsight, it felt like a bit of a crossroads, because it felt like I could have behaved in a particular way and probably not got the same result. Whereas, I mean, don't get me wrong, I doubled down and I got promoted a year later. And actually, with the benefit of hindsight, you know, in a 40-year career, this was like a blip. And I kind of, at the time, though, I couldn't get it into perspective. I was so cross and so kind of, I felt the injustice, you know, and I think the only thing I will say is that I had good people around me, you know, who got me to put it into perspective, whether it was my husband at the time or, you know, other friends or colleagues in work. And I think having people who ground you around you is actually quite important. I think sometimes the pressure is hard, you know, it's, you know, you do need and require a level of resilience. But I think keeping grounded is an important component of being resilient, strangely. So, you know, if you lose sight of who you are on this planet, I always have a picture in my head sometimes of, you know, flattered as I am by your intro and the fact that I've even been invited to come and talk to you and your colleagues and fellow students. But I never lose sight of the fact that is an honour. And if you think about the globe, I always remind myself that I am a spot on the globe. And it's a really good grounding. Otherwise, you know, you lose sight of yourself, you get too big an ego. And look, I won't pretend that presumably at some point somebody might say to you, yeah, she lost sight of her ego. But hopefully not, because that's how my mind works. And I think you can have that level of humility but be, you know, confident, powerful, determined, purposeful, all of those other things. But you know, I think combining those things actually makes sure you preserve a piece of you in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I guess those are all the kind of skills that you need to be a good leader, or at least that I would think of. So it makes sense you've kind of developed those throughout your different changing positions, and staying humble, but also being confident to put your voice forward. Mm-hmm. I think it would be useful for a lot of the people listening to hear your advice on kind of putting your voice forward or going into that office to say, look, this role isn't right for me. Especially when you're starting out, I think it can be quite a scary thing to do. Mm. So do you have any advice on that?
So I'd sort of break that into two parts, actually. People aren't born yes, of course, there are people, I'm sure there are people in your cohort of friends that you think, gosh, she or he's really confident, he's much more confident than me, or whatever else. But the truth is, everybody's got that little person inside them, that slight insecurity, the imposter syndrome, when's somebody going to find me out that, I'm not quite as good as and for some people that voice is louder on their shoulder than for others. And that's really, for me, how confidence manifests itself. I think the other thing I'd say about confidence is don't underestimate, and this is going to sound like a really weird deviation from the question, but don't underestimate how much your physicality can affect how people perceive you. So just to put it into perspective, unfortunately, because we're not doing this in person, you don't get to see the full me. But I'm actually only 5 foot tall, and I wear heels most of the time, which gets me to 5'3", used to be 5'4", but the 4-inch heels have had to go with age. And the reason I tell you that is that they've done studies, digressing completely now, of chief executives. And the average age of a chief exec in the US, where they've done the studies, is about 5'11", and it's not much short of that. 5'11", 6 foot in the UK either. And so you might say, well, I've got a physical handicap. I don't mean that in the disability sense of the word, but in terms of people's perception of you. You don't, some people have a vision of what a leader looks like, and she ain't 5 foot tall, right? So, but one of the things I learned very early on was that if you walk into the room as a small person, people will treat you as a small person. Now, that doesn't mean you bang and crash around, but, where do you position yourself in a room? Do you immediately gravitate towards the corners and make yourself the most insignificant person in the room? And if anybody's read Sheryl Sandberg's book, she talks about this, and I absolutely relate to it. And it was a light bulb moment for me that if you stick yourself on the edges of a meeting, you will be treated like you're on the edges of a meeting. And so I wouldn't underestimate those things, those little cues of how you are and how you are physically, whether you're standing up straight. I mean, you may think I'm nuts, but I could have talked about any number of things, but I actually feel quite strongly about this, which is people underestimate what their physical being is and how they project themselves, whether you make eye contact, all these things. Then the second thing I'd say is that rehearse, be prepared. I've done many of these talks, but what I can tell you is I make space for every single one that I do to think about, well, what is the message that in response to the sorts of questions I might get, have I thought about? And that even applies to conversations. So the most difficult conversations that you have should be the best rehearsed. So if you are going to go and talk to your boss, or you're going, about some sort of change that you want to make, then think about what is it he or she is going to be listening for, and how are you going to articulate it. And my experience is that if you rehearse what you're going to say, you'll say it slightly differently the second or third time, and usually better. That some people have this notion of, if I'm really impromptu, I'm going to come across much better. And I'm afraid over many years I have learned that you can both afford to be impromptu. And look, I haven't rehearsed everything I've said today, but in my mind, I have a map of where I'm going. And the same would be true in a bilateral conversation with my boss that says, I'm thinking I might like to pivot, that if I think about that conversation that I had, I thought about how people would feel about me saying I didn't want to work with them anymore. That's a component. And I thought about the why, and giving some really compelling reasons for the organization and for me, not just about what do I want, how do I want to do it. So however that rehearsal looks for you, lean on your friends, lean on your colleagues, and make sure that you've really thought about things, not overthink it, but thought about things as you consider different moves. Does that make sense, Amelia?
Yeah, I think there's some really great practical tips there. And I think even those small things, like the physical changes you can make you feel more confident as well. And I know for me, when I'm doing interviews, the more I prepare, the better, when it's like for a job or something like that. And I know a lot of people who will watch this will be applying for internships and jobs. And I do think preparing and thinking not just of the questions you might you expect to get, but also more unexpected ones, it is really a great thing to do.
Can I just make one point,
Yeah.
Amelia, because I wouldn't want anyone on this call to think that I think women have to wear 3 or 4 inch heels to succeed. That's a personal choice. And one of the other things I'd say is decide, your identity will change over time, and how you project yourself will undoubtedly change over time. And there's a bit of me that says, don't try and fit anyone's stereotype. Bring a little bit of you. Remember the kind of environment you might be going into. So by definition, don't wear your club outfit to go for a job interview. I'm not suggesting you bring all of that to all of yourself to the situation. But I think you understand what I'm saying, which is that I think, at your core, you have to work out what makes you feel comfortable. And as it happens, high-heeled shoes and lipstick make me feel comfortable. That doesn't mean every woman on the planet needs to wear high-heeled shoes and lipstick.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think it can be challenging being a woman looking to go into these kind of fields where it seems very easy for a man to know like what to wear, just they wear the suit, where it's a little bit more challenging. But I like the idea of bringing you to it a little bit more. So more with regards to that kind of gender diversity issue, you've had a really successful career where you've been in all these leadership positions. How has that journey been in terms of, have you had times when you're the only woman in the room? Did you feel limited by the glass ceiling at any points? How was that?
So I'm going to say something really, really weird, and then I'll explain. So I spent, and I don't know whether it was conscious or unconscious, I spent when I first joined banking, I spent probably, I would say, the first decade not being aware that I was female, which hence the reason I said bizarre thing to say. And the reason I think I did that, and now I've probably overanalyzed it, is that I think it was of a benefit to me because I was never conscious that I should be worried about being a woman. And I would say that to all the women on the call, but it's not just women, it's anybody with a difference, right? If you overthink your own difference, and that's not to diminish the fact that other people might treat you differently, but I think my coping mechanism, and it doesn't necessarily, I'm not suggesting it will always work for everybody, was to actually disregard the fact I was female. Now, does that mean I was walking around like some butch bloke? Answer no. I've always been a very, I'd like to think, quite feminine woman. I haven't sort of done the kind of trying to be a bloke thing, I don't think. Others may be the judge of that. But I think that, I suppose what I'm saying is that in saying that I never sort of was conscious that I was a woman, it's more that maybe that was a coping mechanism. Who knows? Have I been in a room as the only woman? Yes. Have I, unfortunately, still very much more rarely, it still happens today, that I might be the only woman in the room. What I'd say is that I think women are supporting each other better. I think organizations are much more focused on how they can become more inclusive. And so, my journey around gender, obviously you mentioned some of the work I've done around gender and social mobility, but my ambition is to make organizations inclusive so that we value difference, that we don't try and homogenize people, and that there is a stereotype of who can be successful in this organization. And some of that's been hard yards, there's no denying that, but I think there's more work to be done. But those of you who graduate in the next 2 or 3 years and beyond will be coming into workplaces that have now started to have been working on it for some time, but really understand the value of difference inside their organization. Now, whether we harness it as effectively as we should at all times is utterly debatable. So then that brings me to your question about, have I felt the glass ceiling, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I would say that I've been very blessed with is that I've had some great mentors and sponsors. And at this point, I think it's really important to make a difference, to differentiate, because they are different things. They get conflated and people talk about them at the same time. A mentor is somebody who's prepared to give you counsel and nurture you and give you advice. A sponsor puts their own career on the line for you. They push you into roles, they give you opportunities, they give you pieces of work that, you know, truthfully, they give to you because it can make them look good. And I say that not in the way that, I mean, sponsors are very generous people very often. I don't want to sort of paint a picture that they're not. And I maybe it was luck, maybe it was judgment, but coming back to that point about being networked, about being committed, about demonstrating to people your skills and capability, if you are given the opportunity to do that, and I accept sometimes people aren't in that fortunate position, but some of it is, you know, in the workplace, being a bit savvy, keeping your ear to the ground about new opportunities that are coming up in the business, being curious about stuff, expressing, not sitting down and saying this is what I want, but quietly threading into conversations with senior leaders the sorts of things that excite and interest you and that you'd like to be involved in. You'd be amazed how much of that seeps in to the ecosystem and can help with the development of your career. But look, I don't want to. I think, as I say, that where I would come out is that I think we're in a much better place than we were. We have still got a long way to go to make our organisations inclusive, and some of that starts with you coming into the workforce as well. Look, you'll join a culture, and it'll be a culture. And I'm not suggesting that one graduate joining is going to make a difference to that culture, but you know, groups of graduates that join can make a difference. And I think there are much more receptive leaders in the workplace than there were a decade ago.
Yeah, there's a few points there which I'd love to go a little bit deeper on.
Sure.
So you touched on the idea of the sponsor and the mentor, and these ideas I've read a little bit about before. I was reading Carla Harris's Expect to Win. I don't know if you've heard of that, and she talks a lot about it. And I think it seems like a really important thing to try and find yourself a sponsor and a mentor in a firm. But do you have any advice for actually finding someone who could be a good fit for you when you do start out?
Sure. I mean, I always laugh at this. I'm going to say something again. Gosh, I'm being recorded. I probably should be careful. But, you know, that isn't necessarily politically correct. But what I would say is you don't sort of walk up to somebody and say, will you be my sponsor? Will you be my mentor? It's not like sort of, you know, it's a bit like, you know, you wouldn't walk, well, maybe you would, but you wouldn't walk up to somebody and say, can we go on a date? Or if you did, that would be in a completely different setting. It's a much more nuanced thing from my perspective. And so some of that is, I would say all of my mentors and sponsors have come sort of naturally, as naturally as they can. And that's partially back to the networking, getting well connected inside an organization, not doing it in a kind of crude way where you're trying to talk to everybody and be in everybody's ear, but just having a general level of enthusiasm and commitment to the job you're doing. You'd be amazed how much of that seeps into people's consciousness about you and who you are, positivity, going to get things done, not thinking about the 15 reasons why it can't get done. These are all things that people pick up on about you and create, you know, if you like, a mutual kind of mutuality of interest, if you like. I think, you know, I have, of course, I don't think I've ever said to anyone, oh, will you be my mentor? I have said to somebody, you know, do you think we could go for a cup of coffee? Because, you know, I've watched what you do and I'd like to learn a little bit more about X. And out of those conversations have often spawned kind of, I suppose, deeper working relationships where, you know, I've gone to them from time to time with questions. I think if you're asking people to give up their time for you, make sure there's a purpose. You know, having a kind of vague conversation about, it's okay. Sometimes I've had lots of conversations with colleagues, male and female. You know, I don't know what to do with my career. Can you give me some advice? Of course, those conversations happen. But if you're thinking about how you build mentoring relationships, then I think some of that is spawned out of making sure that you make every conversation valuable, particularly as between you and a more senior leader. And then the second thing I'd say is on sponsorship. Sponsorship is usually born out of you doing a great job for somebody. So there've been all sorts of schemes put into businesses, and at one point businesses did think about creating kind of, for want of a better word, artificial or forced sponsor relationships. But the truth is, for me to want to sponsor you, I have to have confidence in your ability. And that typically comes out of having had some sort of working experience with you. So don't underestimate that, everything that you do, and I, as you may have gathered from the way I described my own career, I started at the very bottom, and a big tenet is showing commitment, working hard and doing a good job. I mean, those are like hygiene factors before we even get into the subtle questions of how do I get a sponsor? How do I get a mentor? And when I say work hard, be committed, I don't mean presenteeism and working 24 hours a day as a demonstration. It's the quality of what you do as well. It's the how you do it, how you approach it. Are you inquisitive? Do you look beyond the brief of ways in which you can extend yourself? And those are the things that contribute to you finding yourself as a kind of person that people will want to sponsor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. That's definitely, I think, will be useful for people who are starting out, especially as they're starting in teams and they want to impress their managers to get them to maybe be a sponsor. I think ensuring that you always do a high quality of work is definitely something to take forward. And with those conversations with the mentorship, I guess it's the same thing of preparing so that you can have fulfilling conversations. So you did also touch on the importance of diversity in the workplace and organizations shifting now to become more diverse. I guess it's kind of taken as a given right now, but what do you think are the real benefits of a diverse workforce to an organization and to the individual working in the organization?
Well, where do I begin? Look, the first thing is there's a social, it isn't popular to do this, but there is a social justice point, right? If a proportion of the population looks like X, whether it's female, ethnicity, etc., then surely our workplaces need to reflect a society that we live in. And that, at the heart of it, is where it starts and ends for me. But we always have to think about what's the business rationale, because, if you take the view that businesses have been successful and they weren't that diverse, why would you move to a more diverse workforce? Even though I think the social justice angle is pretty compelling. And the truth is that I think even more so now, given where the world is and where we're going, if you think about the sort of transformation that business has gone through in my lifetime at work, literally I started work and I didn't have a laptop. Now I have 6 different devices and various different routes I can connect with people. And if you think about the escalation of that during the course of even the last decade, iPhones, it's hard for us even to comprehend this. iPhones didn't exist, right? And now, they are practically, part of our anatomy. For those of you who don't have iPhones, I'm sure the Samsung's perfectly good as well. But my point is that this sort of quality of technology wasn't available, and it's changing the shape of the world, and it's changing it at pace. And the truth is that in order to affect that sort of change in business at pace requires a diverse set of opinions around any table. And the reality is that groupthink usually comes from less diverse groups. And I don't mean just visibly, just people think differently, people act and behave differently, they have different lived life experiences. And some of the best ideas in a place like KPMG come from that diversity of thought, the fact that we're all coming from different perspectives. And, there's a great example of groupthink. Years and years ago, and I can't remember what year it was, embarrassingly, but you may remember years ago that one of the first shuttle missions it crashed before it took off effectively. And it had been delayed. And, you know, whether this story is completely accurate is by the by, but allegedly it was quite a junior engineer who put his hand up and said, I'm really worried about some electrical thing, and that's what ground the takeoff to a halt. And they went in a room with kind of all the kind of chief engineers or whatever else. And the guy who was leading it, they had the camera crews were out there waiting for this shuttle to take off. It was a big, you know, bonanza thing. And he sowed the seed of where people would go when he said, we've got 4 hours to fix the problem. Or if we don't get this done in 4 hours, we'll lose the cameras. So already he'd sown the seed, and an entire group of people were working towards a particular outcome. And of course, sadly, you know, it doesn't really matter what the events were that were leading up to that. They allowed the shuttle to take off, possibly because they were working to the wrong ambition, and a group of people had decided they all wanted the same thing. Now, who knows what was in the minds of people, but for me, it is an important illustration of why we need lots of people who are challenging each other, coming from different perspectives. And that doesn't mean that all sits in women or Black people or Asian people or whatever it is. It's every single person around that table needs to have something different to offer. And, you know, I identify very strongly as a woman and a female leader, but that's not all who I am. I'm a curious leader. You know, I'm inquisitive. I like to be challenged. You know, all of these things add to that complex mix. So for me, it's about how we do business and remembering that we're serving as well a very diverse population, and how can we possibly serve that diverse population if we aren't diverse ourselves?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think from so many different points, it's so important to have diverse opinions. And even just in a group discussion, if you have people from different backgrounds, it can be so much more interesting to have your own opinion challenged and kind of consider things in a new way. So you talked a little bit about yourself as a leader. What kind of qualities do you think are important to develop if you do want to be a leader in the future? I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but I would be really interested to hear what you say.
So I think you have to be prepared to do things that you're scared about doing. And the example I use of this is you know, when I first started to sort of take a leadership role, and, you know, as things developed, I for example, hated standing up in front of people and doing this. This would have been like, you know, I'd have been a bag of nerves and, you know, all the rest of it. And now I have a healthy amount of nerves. I always think it's good to have a bit of nerves, otherwise you're not on your game and you know you don't care enough about what it is you're doing. But I kind of had to fight that. So, you know, I just made myself, you know, the first few were just disastrous, right? Just, you know, so the willingness to try new things and to fail actually is quite important. Fail is a big word. I mean, not fail in a kind of, you know, disastrous sense, but not do it as well, you know, and be on a route to continuous improvement. You know, no leader I know, and I know some fabulous leaders, none of them were the kind of finished product, I suspect, when they started. And so just holding on to the fact that, you know, one of the things is, as a leader, you should be continuing to learn. I'm still learning new things. You know, anybody who thinks that there's some sort of destination for leadership and when you get there, you're done, you're the full package, that's just not how it works. And I think having that curiosity and willingness to learn is absolutely critical. I think now people need to be collaborative. You know, we touched on, you know, what are people looking for in the workplace? Of course, they're looking for leaders, and of course, they're looking for people who are confident. They're actually looking for people who are collaborative, that are going to work in teams and contribute in a collective way rather than in a singular way. And I think, you know, the watchword for me is being collaborative. I also think there's a degree of the need to be authentic. I think the way in which the world operates now and the scale of kind of transparency, I don't think there's room for inauthentic leadership. And I think, and I think leaders need to know where their center is, what their core is, what their purpose is, why they're on this planet, and why they're doing what they're doing. Because I think people detect that when you don't know that. So there's quite a lot in there, I guess. But I think the thing I would say to you is, I do think some people are born leaders. You can kind of see it. But I also think people develop into being great leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are really interesting things, because I imagine a lot of those you can build over time, like the mindset of constantly trying to challenge yourself and doing things which are difficult, and then developing through that is something which you can kind of develop through your career, I imagine. So that'll be really interesting, I think, for people listening to this. Now, you talked a bit about being curious and doing all these different things, and I know that you're also the trustee of two charitable organisations, the Eve Appeal and the National Theatre, and I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about those and how you got into those roles and why you are even doing those.
Thank you, Amelia. They both have different reasons how I've ended up there, but they're probably, I've been on a number of trustee bodies actually over the years, and it's been a huge privilege to work with those charities, and I'll talk a little bit about the organisations I'm now involved with. But it's also been a great learning experience, right? Because, I've been sat around the table with people from different walks of life, different fields, and it opens your eyes to different ideas. And so, I'd love to portray this picture of it's all about me giving. Well, I wouldn't actually, because that's not me. But, the truth is that I get so much from it, from both the learning perspective and the opportunity to work with some great people. And if I start with the National Theatre, because it's probably the most recent, and therefore it's very, very early days. I mean, it was only announced in like the last week or two, so I haven't yet done a board meeting. But I think you have to have a passion around the sorts of things that you're going to do. And as a family, my family's been involved with the theatre since I was a child. And it's been, and then when I moved to London, I'm not involved in the theatre in the sense that, other than I'm a visitor to the theatre, but I was a very regular, and when they were open, of course, every week I go to the theatre. I think the theatre has a very, very important part to play in society. Back to my point, it reminds us of our humanity, right? It reminds us of who we are. And there are so many times I've sat in the auditorium after a very long week at work, watching a play that has absolutely no parallel with my life, and learning new things and new ways of looking at things. And I think the arts are an incredibly important part of not just our education, but our ongoing education as human beings. So that's why I was very honoured when the National Theatre approached me to join them, and looking forward to working with them. And then the Eve Appeal is a women's cancer charity. Essentially, we are raising awareness and raising funds for the early detection of women's cancers. I suppose this is the campaigning bit of me coming out. In fact, all gynecological cancers are very, very poorly researched. And they're poorly researched because most of the money that goes into research goes into treatment for cancer, not the early detection. And the sad fact is that the mortality rates for gynecological cancers haven't moved very much at all in the last sort of 40, 50 years, and nor have the treatments. So I am on a mission with my fellow colleagues at the Eve Appeal and very many other connected organisations to raise money to make sure that the very best research gets done. And I'm very hopeful that with the sort of technologies we have available to us now, we can make real progress really fast.
Yeah, they sound like both fantastic causes, and I think it must be so rewarding for you to be able to give back the skills that you've built throughout your career to causes that you really care about now. And I also totally agree with the points about the arts helping you to think differently, and kind of use that to approach your work that you do with like a different perspective. I certainly find that useful. I love reading, so I get that from that. So I guess there's so many questions I'd love to ask, but I'll wrap things up now and I'll just finish off with a final question. So do you have any last words of advice for us young professionals starting out our career? If, for example, if you were starting out now, what would you tell yourself?
Well, there's a few things, there's a few pieces of advice, and then the things I tell myself with the benefit of hindsight. So the pieces of advice, I think I've covered many of them. I think, honestly, don't underestimate demonstrating that level of commitment. And as I say, that's not about presenteeism. It's about being present, being all in, being committed, and then being curious. And what I mean by that isn't just about learning new things, but even just looking at what's going on around you, being attuned to what's going on, and talking to people, and demonstrating that curiosity in a good way. I think the one thing I'd say is that I've probably not taken as much. I mean, some would say I've taken risk, okay, but I think there were moments where I held back from doing things when I should have been stepping in. And I think that's innate in all of us. In some respects, it's probably a good thing, because if you were just diving headlong in just to anything that came your way, then that might beg some questions. But I think say yes. You know, I saying yes has stood me in good stead. It doesn't mean it's always been 100% right, but it's stood me in good stead. And then the last thing I'd say is calibrate, don't catastrophize. I was reading a Harvard Business Review article, and I can't remember there was a psychologist who'd written this piece, and this phrase has stuck with me, and I've been shamelessly using it. And in fact, I should remember who wrote it so I can properly give them credit for it. But it really sums up for me, you know, when things aren't going particularly well, or we have this little bird on our shoulder, a person on our shoulder, or I do, that, you know, historically I'd listen to that too much, and I'd, you know, I don't know about you, but sometimes extrapolate into the very, very worst set of scenarios, and actually sometimes lose any sense of reality. And actually calibrating, and that's why I love the phrase calibrate, don't catastrophize, because sometimes some of these things are going to go wrong. And in fact, you know, in my line of work, you're planning for some of those things. You know, you're putting mitigating action in against those things. But you can drive yourself to insanity, particularly at a personal level, if you extrapolate to the very, very worst scenario. So if there's one thing I leave your listeners with, I think it's calibrate, don't catastrophize.
Well, thank you so much for all of that advice. There's certainly a lot that I'll take away, and I'm sure all the listeners as well. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.